Hello everyone, my name is Hugo, I'm co-founder of Blazity, and in today's video we'll talk about optimizing images for the web. As always, consider liking and subscribing. It helps us out a lot and it will make sure that you can stay up to date with everything we have to talk about. Now the first topic when it comes to images will be lazy loading of images. Now, if you think about lazy loading, you probably think about a couple of things. You probably think about event handlers, intersection observers, but you might not necessarily be thinking about native lazy loading. Now, what I mean by native lazy loading? Well, browsers got really good at loading things, and one of those things is images. Nowadays, whenever you're handling images in any kind of web app, you might not need a single line of JavaScript to actually have every single image in your app lazy loaded. Now, how does that work? Well, when you're using images in your web application or website, you can add a couple of properties to the image tag, which will hint the browser as to what the browser should do with the image. When it comes to the image attributes, the first one that we can talk about is the loading attribute. Now, you can specify the loading attribute for each of the images that you have, and that loading attribute can be eager or lazy. Now, if you specify the image to be of loading type eager, it gives browser information that this is an image that you want browser to prioritize. Whenever you're saying that something is of loading lazy, you're giving browser a hint that this is something that you would ideally want to lazily load afterwards. Now, there are a couple of important things to note here. One is that whenever you say that an image should be of loading type eager or lazy, you're not exactly instructing the browser on what to do. It's more of giving the browser very clear hints as to what to do. Since browsers lazy loading images are using multiple different heuristics to actually determine whether an image should be immediately loaded or should the loading be deferred. And you specifying whether an image is of loading eager or lazy is just influencing those heuristics and giving browser a better idea of how to handle things. Having said that, if you set a loading eager on your image, it doesn't necessarily, well, it doesn't tell the browser at all that this is something that you want to load immediately. What eager says basically is that the browser should just load the image normally without considering any lazy loading in regards to that image. Now, this is where the second property that you can use comes into play, being fetch priority. Now, if you set a fetch priority of high to something, that actually tells the browser as to how fast do you want a certain image to appear on screen. One important thing to note here is that even if the fetch priority is set on high, if the image appears below the initial viewport, the browser will still delay loading of that image, but as soon as it enters the viewport threshold, so the distance from your visible screen to where the image is actually on the screen, the browser will then take your fetch priority high into account. There is a great write-up on native lazy loading being present in the browsers nowadays on web.dev that we'll include the link to in the description. This is something that I would definitely advise that you consider because it makes things so much easier, or it could potentially make things so much easier because lazy loading images without writing a single line of JavaScript sounds like something very interesting. And one last thing on the topic of native lazy loading of images. Whenever you opt in for native lazy loading of the images, it's pretty important that whenever you want to lazy load an image, you also include the dimensions of that image. Now, why is that important? Because before you actually load an image, the only way for the browser to know what size of the image this is actually using the dimensions that you provide with your image. If you don't know the dimensions of the image, it might be a little bit problematic because you kind of run into the situation where you have to do the trade-off of lazy loading images, but actually having layout jumps, because if your browser can't tell what size the image will be, well, it will just show the empty space in that place. Now that empty space might or might not be of the correct size, so just be careful. If your images do not include dimensions, you might run into a situation where you're lazy loading a bunch of images, and as they get loaded, your layout starts jumping, which is obviously a very bad situation that not only impacts user experience pretty heavily, you'll also see this reflect in your Google Web Vitals. An example of an image that should not be lazy loaded is, for example, an image that's part of an LCP, which is largest contentful paint. If the image is a core aspect of the first thing that the user sees when they enter your website, you should probably consider showing it as soon as possible, and rather go ahead and try to make the image as optimized as possible, so user's browser can spend as little time as possible fetching the image, but not deferring the loading of it. Now, as we know, images come in different shapes and sizes, but they also do come in different formats. One of the formats that we can start with is SVG. SVG, being vector graphics, can actually have much more nuance to it when it comes to loading and optimizing things than regular images. An example of a nuance is that SVGs can usually be loaded in two different ways, one being inlining the SVG in your HTML, the other being including SVG as an actual external image, whether it's on a sprite or as just a separate image file. And both of these strategies have, again, their pros and cons. If you're loading in SVG in an inline way, an obvious pro to this is that you don't really have to wait for that SVG to be loaded from an external file. You have it as soon as your HTML loads, as inlining SVG basically means that that SVG now is part of your HTML document, which you have to wait for anyway to display anything on the website. And also, inlining SVGs is a really good way of making those SVGs easily accessible by your CSS properties, since if you're using properties like fill current color in your SVGs, inlining them is a way for them to inherit these color properties from other elements. Externally loading SVGs also has pretty huge benefits, again, depending on your use case. If you have multiple images that are appearing in different places in your web application, maybe your web application is pretty big and complex, having an SVG in an external file used on a multitude of pages might be a better way, since it being in an external file means that it's not part of an HTML document of a specific page, so the browser will have much easier way of caching it and actually displaying it later on different pages. So moving on from vector graphics, we come to more regular images, including formats like PNG, JPEG, and two newer formats. The two newer formats being our focus today. The two new formats being WebP and AVIF. WebP being the little bit older, while still pretty new. It is now supported across every major browser and is a much better way of displaying the images than JPEG and PNG. Majority of the time, whenever your images are actually displayed using WebP, you can expect massive gains in terms of bandwidth used, meaning that your images are going to be much lighter than they would otherwise be if you're using a PNG or a JPEG format. There are a couple of limitations when it comes to WebP. These limitations might not be anything that you particularly care about. They mostly have to do with things like HDR images. Now here is where AVIF comes into play. There is a lot to say about AVIF. It's very new right now, and by very new I mean it's not really supported by every single browser yet. Notably, as of the time of recording this, Safari on both macOS and iOS does not support AVIF. However, AVIF seems to be a much better format to use for your images. Better in a sense that not only does it also support HDR images, but you can also most of the time see big performance gains. Images that you serve might be even much smaller than the already small WebP counterparts. Regardless of how supported AVIF is right now, you should definitely consider it. We'll include some materials down in the description below, so you can read up on AVIF. And even though AVIF is not yet supported by every single browser, you should still consider using it, read up on it, and chances are that AVIF is something that can already improve the loading times and the experience of your users. That's going to be it for today when it comes to images. Now, once again, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to images on the web. There are many more topics to talk about, and we'll definitely talk about them, which is why you should consider subscribing, liking our video, and staying up to date with all our content. Thanks for watching.